they need to make these investments. Today, less than 2% of the $30 billion invested globally in climate adaptations comes from private sources, according to the World Bank. So there is both an opportunity and a need to increase investment from the private sector, both local private sector and the international or global private sector. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion about how to unlock additional private resources for climate resilience and how to help and how local and international partnerships can really help to do this. To kick off the conversation, we are going to go to an interview that I did on Friday with Miguel Franco, the Director of Energy and Climate Change at RTI International. He's in Glasgow for the climate talks, and I'll send it to that conversation now. Miguel, thank you so much for joining us today, and really excited to get your perspectives. I know you are in Glasgow for COP right now. And so I wanted to just dive right in. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about RTI's approach to sort of stimulating private sector investment in climate resilience. What does that look like? What have you learned? How is it evolving?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Let me give you a little bit of a background of RTI, which I think is going to be important for responding to this and other questions. RTI is a very unique organization. I mean, we merge research and implementation on a daily basis. On one hand, we have a strong research and academic background and team, looking at cutting-edge technologies, looking at solutions. And on the other hand, we have a very successful international development implementation arm that merges those research with experience in the field. So that's how we operate on a daily basis. It's a very inclusive process, and we also show that in how we operate on climate finance. We have engineers, scientists, and experts in all sectors like public health, energy, food security, and particularly in climate change, we work in both the adaptation and the mitigation sector. When we work with private sector investment and how to stimulate it, we've worked with private sector for many years in many sectors. And for us, there's always a strong financing component in our projects. So our specific support is usually to de-risk this investment in the specific situation that they are located, either a country or a region or a specific technology that might or might not be proven already. So one element that I would like to respond to this question, and that is right now very important because it's been currently discussed at COP26, is the access to finance activities. RTI focuses on supporting both investors and private sector companies. And on the investor side, we support them with a lot of market intelligence and market knowledge. So they know that their investment is going to a place that will actually have some revenue and they'll be able to repay the loan, basically. And on the side of the private sector companies, we also focus on providing end-to-end capital raise, as well as legal services for them to understand how that loan is going to be repaid, and also how to get to that financing. So we bridge the private sector companies with the investors to make those investments happen.
And when you're talking about private sector companies, are these largely local companies in the countries where you're working? Are these multinational companies? Tell us a little bit about the type of companies you're working with and sort of the different needs or appetite for engagement among different types of partners.
It's actually both, and that's a really good question because we need both. You need the private sector companies in the local market. Why? Because they have a network, because they understand the situation. They are the ones that know that there is a drought and there's going to be issues in terms of payments, for example. But the international companies usually are the ones that bring the funding and bring the drive. So we also make them to make sure that there is, instead of a vertical integration, there is an horizontal integration. And the private sector business model coming from international companies is actually tailored to the local context through partnerships with local companies. Both are important, both grow, And in terms of resilience, our focus is mostly on the private sector side, on the local market. Why? Because what we want to do, and like I said, we have a very inclusive approach, is to make sure that the know-how and expertise stays locally, so they can continue doing this in the future without further funding. Ideal.
So can you give us an example of what this looks like, of the type of, interventions RTI is creating, maybe specifically in the off-grid electrification space, and how those sort of interventions are helping to bring in more private sector actors?
It's hard to choose when we do so much, but there's one that I really like, and that is market dynamics. We have a specific work stream in most of our projects that deals specifically with market intelligence, because you can't enter the market that you don't know. Seems simple, right? But we've seen so many companies going into a region and then failing just because they didn't understand that. Guess what? You went to a place where there is no connectivity. And because there's no connectivity, your pay-as-you-go model doesn't work. So you should have worked under a different business model where you can actually collect payments not through a connection, but face to face. So simple things like that make a huge impact in terms of market entry and in terms of failure or success of these companies, particularly in the off-grid world.
So one of the interesting discussions now, I think, is sort of about in off-grid energy is about the sort of potential for mini grids, which would allow more than just sort of a home level solar system, but maybe could power a whole community and provide a little bit of power. And a lot of those are with renewable energy and could present sustainable options, though they often have some sort of gas or generator backup because of where technology is today. What do you think about that sort of space in the market? Where does that fit in the broader climate resilience picture?
It actually has a very big impact. And regretfully, it hasn't taken off yet. There are differences, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. There are countries a little bit more advanced than others in terms of the policy and regulatory environment that you need for mini grids to flourish, let's say. But at this point, we're not even talking about mini grids. If you really are looking at climate resilience, and time is of the essence for everybody here, we need to look at much larger mini grids that will power not only 100 or 200 households, but small cities and towns. And they need to be decentralized to make sure that they are resilient. We are not there yet, but they are probably the most promising new technology. It's not a new technology. Mini grids have been happening for years. It's really about the business model and the policy and regulatory environment that will make them, like I said, flourish. And it will allow for a lot of things. It will allow, first, for resilience. But the good thing about mini grids is that they are big enough that bring economic growth at the community level. We have solar home systems, which are important. We know all the benefits of bringing electricity to the home. Children, can spend more time studying. You might be able to even cook with some solar home systems. I mean, there are a variety of health benefits to it. But one thing that mini grids bring is productive uses of energy. You have enough capacity to actually bring an income generation activity to the household and to the community level. So now you're bringing revenues to the family. So they can use that revenue, they can use that new income, not only to increase the use of energy, but to increase the use of water, education, health, and of course, time off, which we all need.
Yeah. So a follow-up question to that, because you sort of really laid out the potential of mini grids, but the sort of business model, that private sector case that we can actually go in and do this and make money off of it, hasn't proven out to the point where companies are like jumping into this full force, right? We've seen some pilots, we've seen some examples of this happening. So what will it take to get those partnerships to scale? What have you learned in sort of your collaborations and the types of vehicles that you've put together and in your work with sort of the local and global, private sector actors to scale something like this or other solutions? What do we need sort of moving forward to break that barrier?
You're putting me on the spot here. that's a difficult question to answer, because obviously we haven't been able to break that barrier. That nut hasn't been cracked yet. But I think that there are elements that we all know that need to happen. One of them is finance. We need to have a much targeted consumer finance as well as climate finance that will go support those projects in more direct way as opposed to indirect way. And one issue that we've seen for many years is that when you get a loan in a lot of these projects, you get a loan in dollars or maybe euros, right? But your revenue comes in the local currency. So how do you deal with that difference? How do you deal with a currency that might be fluctuating a lot and maybe a policy and regulatory environment that is not necessarily too stable because it hasn't matured yet, particularly for Minigrids? So those are the elements that we really need to look at, policy and regulatory, a more stable currency, working with local, going back to the resilience, your resilience question, working with local financial investors and with local banks to make sure that there is continuity and that there is a stable financial environment for these projects to happen.
Great. Well, I think we're basically running out of time here, but I'll give you just a few more seconds here at the end of our time to give us any final thoughts on sort of what's the path forward for sort of engagement with the private sector. What does that look like at RTI? What do you think needs to happen more broadly? What's the sort of environment that you're picking up at COP this week in terms of what the future looks like?
It's very exciting. There's a lot of excitement here at COP 26. And I think these few seconds that you're giving me, I'll just say that I'm very happy to see that the panel that we have in this session is to me the right panel. You have there the three main, arguably, stakeholders for this type of conversation. You have the private sector, the public sector, and you have a development finance institution, the DFC in this case, who is very, very involved in sub-Saharan Africa and very involved in their resilience and now in climate change.
Great. Well, Miguel, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation, and good luck with the rest of your meetings and conversations at COP.
Thank you, Adva. Appreciate the invitation.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank Miguel again for making the time for that conversation, and he sort of teed things up for us. I want to introduce this great group of panelists that we have to dig a bit deeper on these issues. I want to introduce Jake Levine, who's the Chief Climate Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, otherwise known as the DFC, and Dr. Pepuke Barduil, who is the Resilience Lead of the Municipal and Environmental Infrastructure Division within the Global Upstream Infrastructure Department at the International Finance Corporation. It's quite a mouthful, Pep. And she is also the former CEO of the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica. So we may be tapping some of her expertise as a former government official. And lastly, but certainly not least, Kumal Khalili, who is the CEO of Zephyr Power. And Zephyr Power developed and operates a 50 megawatt power plant in the Sindh province of Pakistan. It's built on a wetland and designed to consider climate risk and part of an effort to find nature-based solutions. And I know that he'll bring some really interesting insights to this conversation. So as we dive in, I wanted to sort of turn to each of you and ask, how you define sort of the current climate adaptation needs and what you see as the greatest funding obstacles and barriers. Why are we seeing such a sort of low percentage of investments in this area? Jake, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Adva, and thanks for convening this panel and for including DFC. It's wonderful to be here. Hello to everybody from Glasgow. I'm here on the sort of the sidelines of the Blue Zone. And I just want to reiterate some of what we heard in the last panel, which is that this has been a really exciting COP. I can tell you personally, this is my fourth COP, my first one in Copenhagen a number of years ago at this point. And there's just an energy here from the private sector, from the finance community, from business and entrepreneurs that feels different. And it feels like the private sector is coming off the sidelines, not because they're being pushed, but because they see a world of new opportunities to do good and do well by doing good. So it's been sort of buoying in that regard. And I want to get to your question, but I just wanted to give that brief intro as well, because I thought it would just be worth sharing from here in Scotland. When we think about adaptation at DFC, number one, we recognize that we historically have not been doing nearly enough. And I think that your question gets to this point, that when it comes to financing adaptation and resilience projects, it's more difficult. Oftentimes, these are projects that don't have sort of natural streams of revenue. It's not easy to project finance an adaptation deal in the same way that you can do, sort of cookie cutter project finance and debt financing for something like a power project. We asked the question, does a project reduce climate vulnerability? And what that really means is it's referring to any given transaction's ability to strengthen the capacity of individuals, communities, assets to withstand the current shocks and stressors that we're now seeing around the world, and particularly in the countries where we do work. And I think that there are a handful of sort of areas of finance where we're starting to see more maturation and more innovation. One of those areas is in the realm of insurance, where we've been able to finance insurance projects, both actually by investing other financial products into insurance companies and funds, and also by ourselves providing insurance as its own standalone product to provide financing that can help increase the credit rate, the sort of the attractiveness, decrease the credit risk is what I was looking for earlier, and help mitigate other risks like offtake risk, project risk, other operational risks that I'm sure Kumal can speak to a little bit more ably than I, as somebody who's an operator in this world. But we think that there's a much longer way to go ahead. The Biden administration has made a commitment administration-wide, this isn't just DFC, to triple the amount of financing for adaptation and resilience. And we're eager to sort of be at the tip of that spear. And I guess I would say, just in closing in this response to your question, that I'd be very eager and really would be grateful for the opportunity to hear from folks who are watching, to work with this panel to develop some of those products and to be able to extend our reach into the world of adaptation, recognizing that there's a lot of runway left to go down.
Great. Maybe Kumal, we'll go to you next. You want to share your thoughts and from where you sit?
Sure, Jake, thanks for throwing me to the wolves. Appreciate it. Thanks for the early introduction. Adva, you mentioned I was working on a 50 megawatt project. Just to be clear with everyone, it's a wind power project located in the Indus Delta of Pakistan on the coastline. The challenges we have in particular in developing countries is that environment, climate change is secondary to the challenges that we have on the ground. And I think from the point that Jake was making, in that there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of money that's sitting there for investment. But the bigger question ends up being, how do you bridge the gap? How do you bridge the shortfalls that we're having in developing countries with the new world of of new technologies and the objective to address climate issues? In Pakistan today, we still have coal running. We've got nuclear coming online. We've got gas in places where there isn't gas, and we're trying to transport it across the country. So there has to be a linkage between what the needs of a nation are and what the financing facilities are focused on doing. I don't think the conversation is about technology anymore, because you talk about grid stabilizing technologies, battery storage, basic other technologies, but it's more how do you address the needs of a nation, and how do you recognize the historical costs that have been incurred. You build a power plant 6 years ago, say it's a coal plant, you still have to justify the return to the shareholders, and the lenders have to be paid back too. So I think the focus, at least from my perspective, is how do you gauge the reality on the ground for these different countries and then move forward with it. With regards to Zephyr, we had the opportunity, because we're working with two DFIs, CDC and FMO, to really see what was achievable in the area we're located in. We've been very fortunate to have stakeholders who have a very open, dynamic relationship with. And the initial thinking from our standpoint at Zephyr was, let's try and do something different with regards to the environment, and see where we can go with this climate change story. So we put climate and environment and design all on the same page when we were designing our system, and we considered the impact on the environment prior to the finalization of the system. So we get flooded on a daily basis. We say, yes, please, we're happy to be flooded. We have mangroves that we have planted, and more recently, we've had a number of different diplomatic visitors who've been very happy to see the work that we've been doing. And it's a site that's open for people to come visit, because we've really put climate on the same side as technology and same side as development, and in line with stakeholder objectives. So happy to be on this panel. Thank you for having me, Adva. And I will throw it back to you.
Great. Pep, you want to jump in here?
Thanks again for having me join. I think I'd like to build on a couple of points that both Jake and Kamal mentioned, but maybe I could break this down into five, what I see as sort of 5 issues. I think that in the adaptation space, targets have been missing, right? I think with mitigation, I mean, we're aiming for the 1.5 degrees, excuse me. But when we get to adaptation, I think the targets of a small country like a Dominica, a small island like, Barbados versus a Togo, a landlocked or very large coastal country like Bangladesh will be very different, right? So I think that's a starting point. It's very difficult. So one country's targets may not be another, one city's targets may not be another. And without alignment on that, without standardization, or if you want to make it simple, sort of a number of boxes that people can tick saying, we've got that target, we've got this target. It's hard, I think, for a lot of financiers to figure out who they're going to finance and how. So that's the first one. I think the second point is that in reality, a lot of adaptation is business as usual. Okay, so adaptation of the water sector, how do we make sure we have more water? You could argue that is business as usual. Invest in your water company. You could argue, how do we deal with sanitation? How do we deal with, sea level rise? You could argue, well, if you're a coastal country or coastal city, the sea levels, you have flooding anyway. So at which point does this get classified as adaptation versus business as usual? And I think that also makes things a little bit complicated from a financing perspective. And the third point is that ultimately, and having seen this from the ground, doing resilience, doing adaptation requires a holistic and systematic approach, because the issues are systemic, right? They cut across multiple sectors. So it's difficult to finance a project and then say that solves a significant adaptation issue, which means that you need to finance in a programmatic way. And being programmatic across multiple targets designed to address a country, a city, a municipality's resilience issues requires us to take a development planning approach. And once you get into development planning, you're essentially saying, we request that funders come in and fund our development program. And all of a sudden, it's no longer a project. So this is kind of snowballed into a whole approach, a whole of government, and sometimes a whole of private sector approach that needs to be financed. I think we can kind of get into delivery issues after that, but that then adds a further complexity of countries that are the most vulnerable. Many of them are classified as middle to high income if we take island nations, right? If you're middle to high income, firstly, how much you can borrow and the price at which you borrow then becomes a further complexity. And I think the last point is debt ceilings. We'll probably get into this later in the conversation, but it's very unlikely that all of adaptation financing can be done either through private or PPP. So we're going to need a huge amount of either grant or highly concessional lending. And we cannot expect countries to be allowed to borrow 150, 200, 300% of GDP because the current system doesn't allow that. And as a result, you have a number of issues that are layered. Sorry to build a pyramid here, but the reality is that there isn't a single problem. I don't believe that money is a problem. I think the right money for the right targets in the right countries at the right price, delivered over a number of projects that add up to a program and a whole of government approach, makes it a little bit tricky for the way many of our structures are set up. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, because I think there are many examples of where it is working. It just requires us to think a little bit differently about the adaptation question.
Yeah, and certainly I think, the COVID crisis has laid bare some of those challenges that, small island developing states in particular are facing, and some of the debt and borrowing challenges that they'll face as they're looking to address climate moving forward. I think you've sort of teed up another question that I have, which is really looking at, you said that there's no sort of one actor that can do it alone. You need that public money, that grant capital. And I think that one of the questions that we're trying to get at today is, how do you design the structures that are going to bring in that grant capital at the right level, that will then be able to mobilize that additional private sector money that's out there? I know that's something that IFC and DFC think about. What is your leverage ratio? How much, dollar, for every dollar you spend, how much dollar private sector money are you able to bring in? But let's talk about that a little bit. How, you both, as DFIs and IFI, you have limitations on how you can lend and the structures in which you've been set up. So are you looking at more creative vehicles? Is there a need for an outside blended fund that you could put money into, but would get around some of the individual challenges that you might have? So Jake, Pep, I don't know which one of you wants to jump in on this first, but would love to sort of hear your thoughts about the role of different partnerships in helping to mobilize or unleash that capital.
I'm happy to jump in here, and then I expect Pep will in a much more articulate and organized way develop the thoughts. I want to associate myself with all of her comments and all of the 5 sort of challenges, because they're spot on, and I think we've found some ability to mitigate some of those risks, to be working cross-sectorally, to be thinking about pulling in the right actors from the right institutions and with the right financial tool. But as she noted, the real sort of primary limitation is not the capital; it's the projects. It's finding investable projects. And I think one of the models where we've recently found some success, and I think would be really transferable in the world of adaptation and resilience, is working very closely with the philanthropic community. Because one of the things that we talk about a lot is how is DFC mobilizing capital from the private sector? And actually, it's worth taking a step back, as painful as it may be, and thinking about how are we having our capital mobilized? Because there is some expectation in the market that DFC, with its new equity financing authority and its ability to invest in funds, can sort of fit into a concessional finance slot in any given sort of capital stack and in a blended finance arrangement. And I think it's true that we should, but at the moment we haven't quite figured out how, and we're working on doing that. One of the ways that we're gaining some really valuable experience is working with the organizations that play that role very affirmatively and very purposefully. We announced on Tuesday here at COP, we were sort of a part of the Rockefeller Foundation Global Energy Alliance announcement, which is more on the mitigation side, but sort of has 2 focus areas, one on distributed renewable energy and one on sort of creating a platform for an energy transition away from fossil infrastructure and towards cleaner power infrastructure. And we have begun the work on the DRE side of that equation. And with Rockefeller's commitment to invest $50 million of concessional finance, we have received over $1 billion of applications from the market on DRE, and we've been able to sort of initially vet the debt side of that, which is actually just half of those applications, and we think that we have line of sight towards $215 million of DRE projects. These are small, in most cases, less than a megawatt size power projects, mini-grids, distributed energy systems, in some cases with energy storage. These are critical actually also for adaptation and resilience. So even though they're contributing to the mitigation side, you start to see some of this systemic blurring that I think Pep was referring to, where you have to work all of these things together. And the thing that's been really powerful for us about this partnership is that the Rockefeller financing has helped to unlock a world of DFC financing, which then has a sort of a knock-on effect with the private sector, because we're able to pull in our partners in the bank, in sort of the private sector banking industry, and also other DFIs. And I think that if this model sort of bears out, and we expect that it will, there's a tremendous amount of supply on the philanthropic finance side coming into these markets. And we think that we can mobilize that really effectively. In that case, just anecdotally, that would be like a 10-to-1 concessional to DFI financing. And then we haven't done the math on how much we're able to then in turn mobilize from the private sector, but you'd have sort of a multiplier there too.
I'm happy to jump in, and thanks for your kind words, Jake. I think we need to catch up for coffee. I think what you're doing with Rockefeller sounds really exciting. We're also doing a few things with them as well, but I'd like to focus maybe on a couple of other examples. So Adva, you asked about instruments or tools, and I think that there are a few that have been in existence for some time. The question is, how do you get more out of them? But there are also some newer tools, right, that kind of look a little bit, look like a usual animal, but have some nuances to them. So, one of the ones that I see has actually come up in the chat around PPPs. So I do think public-private partnerships are critical. A lot of this is about risk allocation along the value chain. And I'd like to give a couple of examples of some of the things that IFC is doing, but also sustainability-linked financing. I think that's a space that is fairly new in terms of how we structure lending. So typically with, green bonds or, social and sustainable financing in the past, you said, okay, there's a desire to use funds or use proceeds in a certain way. But what I mentioned all the way at the beginning, which is linking to targets, you're actually aspiring to something, is something that is slightly different with SLF. And here we have examples of pricing that can then address this other issue that I mentioned, which is, how do you bring down the cost of financing? So you price along the lines of targets. So to the extent that a company or an entity meets targets, the pricing is attractive. Where they defer or are not able to hit targets, and there isn't a particularly good reason for it, the pricing ratchets up, and therefore you're providing an incentive or disincentive to behave in a good versus a less good way. So I think those are two instruments that are useful to dig into a little bit more. In the PPP space, we have an example that's actually fairly recent, and this is in India. This is a Ganga, what we call the Namami Ganga program, which is delivered through the private sector, and that's looking at wastewater treatment in Bengal. The source of water for about 400 million people is the Ganga River, and it's incredibly polluted. And I think, if you, again, take that business as usual versus resilience or adaptation perspective, the line is a little bit blurred, but I would argue that if we don't address these issues, that 400 million becomes, 500-600 million, because water resources in other parts of the country are maybe strained. And what was once an issue in just, health and hygiene becomes an issue. You talked about COVID, that has much broader implications if not addressed. I think these are where some of the nuances around resilience get lost. It's about having a decent quality of life. It's about being able to bounce back better. How do you bounce back better if you don't have income? How do you bounce back at all if you're unhealthy and you have no way of getting treatment? So one way of dealing with this is to address the problem further upstream, right? Don't pollute in the first place, or deal with some of the more manageable sort of water treatment issues that can be dealt with. So, the Ganga River the Ganga River project looks at reducing wastewater discharge by 15%. That's a very concrete target. How do you deliver that through a public-private partnership? So again, it's kind of blending the two things. We have additional examples in the SLF or sustainability-linked financing space, where currently only about 5% of sustainability-linked financing is being delivered in emerging markets, right? So it's 95% in other markets. How do you get that 5% up to a 30, 40, 50%? Because these are the countries which require A, the financing, and B, the resilience-oriented investments. And here we've got a number of really interesting examples. So, maybe I'll give the mic back to you as we get the opportunity further down to talk about them, so we can get into sort of concrete cases. But yeah, for now, I would say that the issue is not instruments. The issue is not the instruments, it's the application of the instruments. And I think leveraging more blended finance and a little bit more risk-taking on the part of those entities that have soft money available.
Maybe a little bit more risk-taking from the likes of IFC too, many people might argue. At least that's what I hear from folks. Kamal, I want to come to you because I'd like to hear a little bit about sort of your funding journey and sort of from your perspective as, a wind power project developer looking to do this in a really sort of delicate environmental area, looking at a lot of these challenges. What was sort of the linchpin for getting that funding? I know you have funding from a couple of DFIs, which I assume means that funding was not available to you sort of on the commercial markets. How did that help sort of de-risk or bring in other capital? What does that look like today?
Sure. Thanks for asking that question. So Zephyr has been funded in by the CDC, and it's also been funded in by FMO. CDC is actually both on our equity side and debt side. And they took a substantial position of just under 50% on the equity side. And Zephyr is, I believe, the first and only project that CDC has invested in on both sides of the capital structure. So that was actually a fascinating argument. We'd have equity and debt arguments across the tables because all the people were working on the same floor, the floor above. Very early conversation because we had CDC taking a substantial position and it being a very visible investment. Their first investment back in Pakistan as a direct investor when they shifted from their fund of funds platform to the platform that they have now. And very early conversation we had with them because not only was I interacting with the equity side and debt side, we were interacting with the governance side, transparency side, and environment, social governance. So given that we were already we were a visible investment for them, and given our location, the conversation, even before we started finalizing the system design, was how is the environment? What are you doing to mitigate it? And are you thinking about these issues ahead of time? What I find with a lot of projects, having worked not only in Pakistan, but Japan and in developing countries, and of course in the States and Europe, is that the thinking is first of the project and environment and governance is secondary. We made the effort within Zephyr to actually take ownership of environment and governance and a corporate community, etc. That all intertwines within our site, because when you talk about mangroves, you talk about community, you talk about resilience, you talk about protections, etc. And it's not a money conversation, and I think that mentioned it probably in that, hey, stop polluting upriver, and then you don't have the issue. So there's two effects. It's government regulators all need to actually perform their role to do whatever prevention they can. And then with regards to projects, etc., the financing comes with these obligations. Whether the financier is enforcing that position or whether the financier is working in partnership with the project company they're working with, I think it's very important to have that conversation, not only from the side of the DFI to the project company, but also from project company to DFI. We did this work without consultants. Very early on, I said, we on the ground need to learn. The people need to learn what the policies are, how to implement IFC guidelines. I think the guidelines are fantastic. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of work that's been done by some very intelligent people on setting up these frameworks. But the challenge of implementing the frameworks exists, and they're not complicated. The mentorship is needed, the education is needed, grassroots efforts are needed, and if the charm doesn't or saying please do the work doesn't work, the stick has to be used, because ultimately we can't keep functioning in this manner, and the parties ultimately need to be held accountable in the process.
Thanks for that. I think that tees up another question, which I wanted to talk about and get into a little bit, which is about this issue of accountability. IFC, DFC have frameworks and requirements for projects to meet. And I think that sometimes there is a lack of transparency in sort of seeing what are the outcomes. Are those being met? What are the internal policies? Are you going to someone who you funded if they're not meeting some of those targets and benchmarks and rethinking that? Are you structured in a way that allows that? And how much of that are you sharing publicly so other groups can help that accountability? Because otherwise you risk ending up in a system where you have organizations like Zephyr who are trying, and doing their part to meet all these commitments, and other companies that might not be, and you don't have sort of a level playing field or the incentives in place. And so I guess, Pep and Jake, how are, IFC and DFC thinking about this challenge? Are you thinking about sort of increasing transparency? I know both of you have systems that you've implemented. IQ, I know, is fairly new at DFC, but is supposed to look sort of across the life cycle of a project. How much of that will be made public? I know DFC said they're going to try to be on board with this new transparency tool that just launched last week that is supposed to push DFIs to sort of share more information, including at the project level. So Jake, maybe we'll go to you first, but how do we ensure this accountability piece and this transparency piece to ensure that, your dollars are being spent effectively in this space?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer, but there's been a lot of activity in the chat on this notion of getting projects in the pipeline that are bankable, more or less, and also supporting local organizations, whether those are local small businesses or NGOs or sort of other community organizations that can help in that work. And there's one thing I want to add to that conversation, because I think it's really important about some of the new tools that DFC has, and I want to make sure everybody here is aware of it. And again, we're the newest federal agency. We're working with new financing tools, and it's a transition period, and we need help, frankly, to sort of iron it all out and make sure these tools fit the right markets. But one of the really exciting tools, and it doesn't get as much play because they're smaller dollars, but it's our technical assistance financing, which the BUILD Act authorized DFC to provide in the context of providing basically pre-financing grants to help enable projects, individual projects, to mature and ripen so that they could then be ready for at-scale commercial financing, either on the equity or the debt side. And this is where we've seen a lot of innovation coming from the market in terms of actual projects and the diversity of the types of approaches to things like adaptation and resilience. So I wanted to just highlight that as a little bit of a note for further collaboration from the private sector and the NGO community here. To your point on transparency, accountability, this is critical to our work. We've got a lot of sort of built-in transparency and accountability measures in terms of our governance. First of all, we're an independent agency, and we're governed by a board. And most of our transactions go before the board. And in addition to having a board review process, and by the way, we're required by statute to have 2 public board meetings a year. So we tend to do that every other board. And we really appreciate, I've attended now 1 in the 6 months that I've been at the agency, but we appreciate the back and forth from the public. And it's a good venue for stakeholders to get on the record in terms of raising issues and sort of holding us accountable. We also have to notify Congress for any transaction over $10 million. And that's a statutory requirement. Any congressional notification provides another layer of sort of sunshine in terms of what we're doing and an ability for the public to engage. But then you note some of the internal sort of mechanisms and measures that we're working on. The impact quotient, the IQ, is something that's key to sort of how we're thinking about sort of scoring projects on their way in when they get to something like our credit committee, our investment committee, but also working to ensure that as they're implemented and they're operating, that the projects are actually having meaningful impact. And as you note, I don't want to get too far ahead of my colleagues who are in the midst of sort of revising that. It's undergoing a very active, affirmative sort of refresh. And I think that the team that's doing it comes at this with many, many years of development finance experience and expertise, and is like the right team for this moment. Very aligned with the mandate and the spirit of the Build Act. So I look forward to having the chance to share more about that as it's more publicly available. But I just want to signal to the group here that this is a major area of focus. We're investing a tremendous amount of resources into this, and we welcome further input and back and forth from the public on it.
Great. I want to turn to you, Pep, and ask not only from an IFC perspective, but as someone who worked for government, what is the role of governments in this accountability piece? What is your role in ensuring that, a government's role in ensuring both that the sort of environment operates properly, but also that there's accountability for companies that are working, within your borders on these issues?
Thanks for the question. Actually, there were a couple of points that Jake mentioned that I really wanted to jump in on. So maybe I'll do a bit of a hybrid response. Look, I think that the main role of government is to define a very clear path forward, right? And again, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but if you're not clear on the targets that you want to achieve, then where you're heading is very fuzzy, right? So I think that's the first point, is to say, listen, this is our aspiration. And I think once you have that, you can start to focus on the policy and the legal framework that's going to get you where you need to go, right? So if you say we want to achieve 100% renewables, where's the policy and the legislation that defines that? You can't just have a grand vision. I'll give you, maybe staying away from specific country examples, I'll just kind of give you the broad brushstrokes of what I think needs to be put in place. So I think there's clearly the targets of legal and policy framework. But then I think there is a piece that's sort of generally missing from the discussion, which is that most governments, be they subnational or national governments, certainly in developing countries, are either responsible for or certainly take it upon themselves to be very clear in defining what major capital projects need to get done. So you often say, well, we want to, build a stadium, or we want to, kind of do, retaining walls across the country, or we want to do new water and sewage treatment. But if you're not clear on the types of projects that you want to build and why, where, and when you want to do them, then they're not going to get done. So the why should tally with your targets. If you set a target of X, but your projects are Y, Z, X, Y, Z, B, and C, they're not matching the targets, right? So I think that's the first piece. So that gives the private sector some clarity about where you want to go and how you plan to get there. You plan to get there using certain projects. Then the next question is, how do I get my foot in the door as a private sector? Where's the opportunity for me? Are you structuring this as a PPP? Are you defining the project and then leaving space for the private sector to come in because you want it to be, managed by the private sector? Which pieces are you carving out for the public sector? So I think having a very crisp and robust. When I say robust, it's not just the roadmap for this year or this administration. It's a roadmap tied to targets that have been set for the country for the next 20, 30 years. That gives the private sector some sort of direction in terms of where they want to go. And thereafter, you can start to put into place procurement rules. How do you tender things out? How do you make sure that when you're doing lending, it's sticking to certain rules and frameworks that ensure transparency? So I think that it's easy to use language like transparency, but that comes at the back end of a chain. And a lot of the front end can only be made accountable to the people of a country, a city, a municipality, because ultimately your first constituents are the people that a government is serving. And thereafter, the procedures, I think, for ensuring transparency and reporting are pretty well known on the back end of it. If I could just come in quickly with a plug, I'm going to jump on what Jake said. While IFC is not the type of multilateral development partner that provides a lot of technical assistance up front, because I've seen a lot of this in the chat. What we do through a number of sort of parts of the institution, be it our climate business group that has tools like the APEX tool that looks at mitigation opportunities, EDGE and BRI, the Building Resilience Index, that kind of look at, where are there opportunities in buildings, in cities, in power generation. That helps identify the opportunity. And so you could maybe not call that traditional technical assistance, but it certainly is investment identification. I sit in a team that does very, frontier business development. We call it upstream, but it's really not to be confused, because I saw it in my bio with traditional upstream. This really is business development. And that involves providing assistance, working with companies, working with municipalities through our cities program to identify opportunities for investment. And I think linking that funding support to investment on the back end is probably the best way to get things done. So I wouldn't say that we're absent it. It's just that we use very specific means to identify opportunities down the road.
Great. Kamal, there were a couple moments there where it looked like you wanted to jump in and say something. And so I'll give you the chance to jump in now and just ask, what you think is, I know one of the things that you've sort of said to me is sort of the need for local capacity in addressing some of this. So as you respond, tell us a little bit about what you think is needed to build that local capacity for some of these projects and to ensure that project developers are sort of following the appropriate guidelines.
Sure. I just want to, the reason I was bobbing my head is points what Pep were making was spot on. The fundamental problems we have out here is that there is not clear guidance, and for private sector doesn't care what the opportunities are. They just want clear understanding of where things are going. And if we're able to achieve that, that's great. The fundamental problem in that theory doesn't translate to actual boots on the ground implementation, because everyone has, Pakistan's a country of 200 million people. There's no way you're going to get the provinces to come on the same page. There's no way you're going to get the local bureaucrats to come on the same page. So theoretically, Pep, I'm in full agreement with you, but implementing that and getting rid of the historical weight that you're carrying is essentially an impossibility, and these things have to be done incrementally, and there is going to be a cost to them. Question ends up being, how do you transfer that cost across stakeholders, or do you make it a public cost, which you could put an investment vehicle together and trade it on the stock market if you wanted to. Coming back to the question you had asked in terms of implementing on the ground. All of this work that is being done by Jake and by Pep and by all the DFIs is brilliant work. But having stakeholders be educated and having stakeholders buy into the philosophy, the approach it's extremely challenging. Grant was kind enough to put a post on the chat, and it's not a cost issue, Grant. It's really If you ask us the amount of money that we spent doing mangrove protection work, you'd be shocked. It's pennies on the grand scheme of things in terms of our revenue stream. It was a simple conversation 4 years ago where a forestry department person came to visit me and said, Kumail, I want to plant mangroves on your site because we have a mandate to plant 1 million mangroves. And my response was, sure, I will do 2 things. I will stop the camels and I'll stop the fishermen from going into the mangroves. We did that work. So it's not expensive to do at all. Stakeholder and sponsor has to be responsible and really pay attention to that, because it's not a short-term return when you're doing large-scale projects like this. It's a long-term return. And there is a tie-in, historically it was to a bottom line. I don't know what the new term is now, but there is a tie-in with the environment and the return that you're making on your asset. And that's something that we're seeing on a daily basis. Transparency is key. Well, Pep mentioned it as a tail end event. I think in a existing environment, you have to be transparent from day one, because then that's the only time you can get all stakeholders on the page, given everyone's influences that play into it.
Right. Thanks, Kamal. We are nearly out of time here. I want to give you each about 30 seconds for any final thoughts, or sort of what, when you look ahead, what you think is sort of needed. Jake, you're at COP this week. I wonder whether there are conversations you're having there that will end up, in some time finding out that that's, mobilizing new capital. But so for each of you quickly, what do you think is needed as we look ahead? Jake, we can go to you first.
I think, in order to really, look, governments here and everybody here is talking about this $130 trillion of assets under management that is going to be committed to net zero. And I thought one of the really on point comments that I heard on that from a friend at a regional development bank was, well, that's great, but it's all in the wrong currency. And, I think this recognition that it's not a one size fits all, and we need to have a more surgical approach to sort of finding the right tools for the right projects for the right markets. And one thing that would be great to develop, and one thing that we're working on with our sister DFIs and friends in the MDB community is, approaches to partnership, to standardization, to teaming up, to syndicating, to clubbing into deals and working together more, because I think that everybody sort of has a different tool set. And when you isolate them between DFC and IFC and EBRD and the others, it's hard to pool, to come out on the other end with the exact right combination. So I'd like to see us working better together and sort of using that collaboration to develop the right exact sort of precise toolkit for the right market and the right project.
All right, Pep.
I agree with all of Jake's points. Maybe I'll just add 3 more. I think that there's a lot of data floating around, right? Be it up in the cloud or in, government filing cabinets. There's a huge amount of work has been done over many, many decades that pulls together, risks and vulnerabilities that places, countries, cities, and even private sector assets actually face. So I think using that data, so we're very clear in establishing the baseline. Where do we stand today? So it's one thing to say, oh, we all want to become resilient, but we don't, frankly, in many cases, know where we are right now. Sorry, that's my cuckoo clock in the background. So I think, being very clear on what the targets are, but then also being clear on the baseline, right? And where is it that we need to go from to? I think the second piece is to leverage some of these instruments that we've talked about much more actively. And that's honestly going to require a little bit more, lack of a better word, fearlessness, particularly on the parts of decision makers in the broad scheme of things, right? So governments are going to have to be much more proactive about saying, look, these are all the things we need to invest in. We can't cover it all. Help us deal with some of this, right? Otherwise, they're not going to hit their targets. Be part of this. So I think this is Jake's point around partnerships. I don't think it's just at the MDB or DFI level. I think it's also at the public and private levels. See each other as partners rather than as adversaries. And then I think the last point is really trying to get the pricing down. And this is where leveraging some of that soft capital that's going to need to come in larger volumes is critical. Otherwise, we will not be able to afford it. And thanks for the opportunity.
Great. Wow.
Sure. Just closing it out. All points from Pep, Jake. There was a touch on new capital financing structures, which I think are critical. Even before that, I think the knowledge base that sits with the DFIs in terms of actually developing compensation structures that are purely focused on sustainable technologies. We're having conversations today in Pakistan about how do you finance battery storage technologies? How do you finance spinning technologies? So it's not about technology here, it's about maturing the regulatory framework and identifying compensation mechanisms for stakeholders. And lastly, and I think Jake mentioned it first, is that it's in the wrong currency. That's something that we struggle with on a daily basis. Doing wind power in Pakistan, you're looking at today's pricing is probably about $60 million, and about 2/3 of that is flowing out of the country. And it's a constant struggle to on the long-term basis to make the debt payments. We pay it in dollars, and there's a whole conversation that happens on indigenization. I think India's done a fantastic job with that, but a lot of countries which don't have that base really need to think about how many dollars they're getting and how can they adopt these technologies when they aren't built locally. So if the DFIs, as the DFIs look at this localization of currency, removing that dollar export, currency export requirement, that would probably make the biggest impact in at least in Pakistan and in most developing countries, which are struggling with meeting their exchange balances.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being with us today. It sounds like we have plenty of follow-up at Devex here to find out how you're doing on these things moving forward. So thanks to all of you very much. Thank you again to RTI International for partnering with us to have this conversation today. And I wanted to invite you all to join the Devex at COP26 Summit, which starts tomorrow. So please sign up and join us for a lot more conversations, discussions, and a really great event to further examine some of the challenges at this nexus of climate and development. Thank you all.